On 25th March 1912, Titanic's crew began assembling in Belfast. Captain Herbert Haddock of the Oceanic was made captain of the Titanic, thus making her the ship's first captain. However, this was only to familiarize him with the Olympic-class ocean liners, as the plan was to give Titanic's command to Captain Smith and Olympic to Haddock once Olympic returned from New York. On 1st April, Smith took command of Titanic from Haddock, and Haddock sailed the Olympic to New York just 2 days later. Because of bad weather, Titanic's sea trials were delayed, but by the morning of Monday, 1st April, the weather seemed calm, so it was decided that they would start the trials next day. At 4 a.m. the next day, the Black Gang got to work, and that's because they had to start producing enough steam before the ship actually started moving. At 6 a.m. the sea trials began, and first they did it in the Belfast Lock, which is an arm of the sea located near Belfast, and then 4 tugboats assisted the Titanic in crossing the Victorian Channel into the open waters of the Irish Sea, and that's where they conducted the remaining of her sea trials. Here's a colorized version of an original photograph of Titanic that was taken while she was leaving Belfast for her sea trials. You might ask, what happens in sea trials? So basically, these are just tests conducted to check whether a ship is safe enough to set sail or not. So in Titanic's case, they tested how long the ship took to come to a stop from full speed and how much space it took to turn by measuring the circle that it formed while turning. And they also tested the safety equipment like the watertight doors as well as the radio equipment which had been installed on the ship. Some people now assume that these sea trials were rushed because normally sea trials will last 2 to 3 days, but these ones were just a few hours. But this assumption is most likely not true because you see, not a single member of White Star Line was on board. So no one could have actually pressurized them to finish the sea trials as quickly as possible. In fact, only members of Board of Trade and Harland and Wolff were on board, and Board of Trade were the ones who were checking whether the ship is seaworthy enough or not. And the truth is, they could have actually asked for longer trials if they felt unsatisfied, but it seems that they were satisfied. Now, we don't really know how long the sea trials lasted. It's normally suggested that it was somewhat between 6 to 9 hours, but the trouble is that all of the surviving officers who were all on board, they just gave different answers and none of them actually agreed with one another completely. And same goes for the departure time for Southampton, which could have been as early as 8 p.m. or as late as 9 p.m. though I chose to go with 8 p.m. in this video because they all seem to agree that they left for Southampton almost immediately after returning to Belfast and getting that certificate. So at 7 p.m. the Titanic returned to Belfast, and here the Board of Trade agents signed the certificate of seaworthiness for Titanic, valid for 12 months. And it was at this point that they actually registered the Titanic in Liverpool under the number 131428. Officer Lightoller claims that they also put some equipment like chairs and stuff on the ship, but he's the only one who says that. But he says it was done quickly and then we left. At 8 p.m. the Titanic departed Belfast, bound for Southampton. Now there is something interesting about the Titanic's crew that you should know at this point. At this point, the chief officer was William Murdoch, first officer was Charles Lightoller, and the second officer was David Blair. This arrangement will not only change later on, but will also have effects lasting like late into the disaster. They are connected to the disaster. So much of the journey was apparently very uneventful, but then Boxhall claims that from 2 a.m. to 6 a.m. on 3rd April, the Titanic encountered fog. But we don't know whether Captain Smith chose to slow down at this point or not. At 7:19 a.m., Titanic passed passed by some offland lying rocks and islands that are known as the Smalls. At 10:30, it was reported 150 miles east of Fastnet Rock Lighthouse, which is located off the southern coast of Ireland. At 12:30, Titanic crossed Land's End in Cornwall, and at 1:35, they crossed Lizard Point, which is also in Cornwall. And then from there, they proceeded nearly 8.5 hours straight, and stopped at 10 p.m. to pick up the harbor pilot at Nab Lightship at the Isle of Wight. This pilot's job was to guide the ship into Southampton waters. And at 11:30 p.m., the Titanic arrived at berth 44 in Southampton docks, the same place which Olympic had left earlier in noon. 5 red funnel tugboats assisted the massive liner with docking, and by 12 a.m., the Titanic had docked in Southampton. At 1 a.m., the White Star Line office in Montreal, Canada was notified that the Titanic has docked in Southampton. So now the Titanic awaited arrival of her passengers, remaining crew members, as well as cleaning, food, fuel, and final touches, because the interiors weren't fully finished at this point. And a lot of things about the interior, like the kitchen stuff, the crockery, was actually supposed to be installed on the ship while it was in Southampton, not in Belfast. And speaking of food, there was tons of it on board, and you can see all the list of stuff that was on board on this screen. Now, as for coal, this was a hard task, and this was mainly because of the coal strike, which had started on 20th February and had just ended on 6th April, which meant that there wasn't enough coal in supply. But White Star did not wish to, delay Titanic's maiden voyage. It would be disaster. So they decided to do whatever was necessary. The Olympic had bought some extra coal from New York, and they had this coal stored in the White Star dock. So they gave this coal to Titanic, along with coal from other ships whose passengers and crew members were transferred to Titanic as well. Not all of them were, but there were passengers that transferred from other ships as well. The White Star Line cancelled the voyages of its ships Adriatic and Oceanic, while another ship, the SS Philadelphia, also had its voyage cancelled and passengers transferred to Titanic. In fact, Eva Hart, the famous survivor, was actually supposed to set sail on the Philadelphia. Now, in hindsight, we also know that if this coal strike wasn't there, then the North Atlantic shipping lane would have been much busier than it was, and perhaps more ships could have been closer to Titanic for help than they originally were. Titanic's bunkers could carry somewhere between 6 to 6.6 thousand tons of coal, and according to records, Titanic was carrying 5,892 tons of coal while it left Southampton. And the coal laying process actually took 2 days, being completed by 6th of April. On 5th April, the Titanic was dressed in flags for Good Friday, although famous book On a Sea of Glass says it was done not for the holiday, but as a salute to the city of Southampton. But either way, it wasn't open to the general public. Only special visitors were allowed. But that's not for some conspiracy theory or switch theory and all that, but it's simply because the White Star Line was rushing for the maiden voyage. Here's another photograph of the ship on Good Friday. On Saturday, 6th April, the assembly of the remaining crew was nearly completed, and most of these crew members were natives of Southampton. General cargo also started arriving. On Sunday, 7th April, a local photographer, G.D. Courtney, took this famous photograph of the Titanic. And this photograph is not to be confused with a similar one which was actually taken 3 days later of Titanic departing Southampton. On Monday, 8th April, workmen in bosun chairs painted the ship's funnels in classic White Star buff livery. So this was a color that was somewhere between yellow and orange, though it was more orange than yellow. Titanic's funnels weren't exactly orange or yellow in color, and that's a point that should be remembered. Then on Tuesday, 9th April, multiple events took place. So firstly, Captain Maurice Clark, the immigration officer of Board of Trade, came on board to inspect whether the Titanic was actually suitable for carrying migrants or not. And second officer David Blair gave his sister a tour of the ship. He was actually very excited that he would be going on this ship for the maiden voyage. At this point, carpets were being laid and a lot of fresh flowers were purchased in bulk from a local florist. And it is believed this was done to mask the smell of fresh paint applied to the ship since its arrival in Southampton. Then the second event was Mr. Andrews wrote to his wife in the evening that Titanic is now about complete, and I think I will do the old firm credit tomorrow when we sail. Now his wife and daughter weren't amongst the passengers, and that's probably the reason they survived. Mr. Andrews wouldn't survive in the disaster. The third event was actually quite significant. Henry Wilde was transferred to the Titanic as chief officer in late evening. So at this point, Murdoch and Lightoller both got demoted and David Blair was removed from the Titanic. He was disappointed, and because it was done in such a hurry, he forgot to hand over the keys to Lookout's binoculars and the crow's nest telephone to Lightoller. So yeah, that's why today we know that the Lookouts did not have binoculars on the night the Titanic actually hit the iceberg. And something bizarre also happened at this moment, and it lasted for the rest of the voyage. So you see, the change was so sudden that Murdoch and Lightoller did not have enough time to change into their rank uniforms. So Murdoch and Wilde, during the whole voyage, were both wearing the chief officer's uniform, and Lightoller was wearing the first officer's uniform. And this is something which comes in handy later on when we discuss the officer suicide mystery. Then from the evening of 9th April till the early morning of next day, no other significant event occurred. Thank you for watching.